You don't expect the idea of slaves working, in the modern world. Sure you don't. And yet there have been cases. I mean, the Rooney family slave ring, which we're going to talk about, because there's been one of the victims has just received some compensation after all these years. But I recall that story breaking. You were doing a lot on it at the time. It's 7 years ago now, and their site had been raided in the UK where they lived. And all these sort of vulnerable people had been found living in sheds and without proper shelter, and they were being worked for no pay. I mean, it was a crazy story.
Yeah, and it wasn't the first time, because there've been a couple of similar kind of schemes by gangs involved in the same kind of work. Whether it was rogue trading, rogue building, and driveways and landscaping, this sort of thing.
That's the kind of work they were getting them to do, was it?
Yeah, it was hard physical labouring. Yeah. And I suppose to kind of put a bit of context to it, there would have been a practice among certain Irish businesses, people, running kind of a family-based operation, going door to door, looking for this kind of work. And for years, there would have been a tradition that, they would have taken on casual workers who would often kind of live on the sites with them. They'd get a caravan of their own, that sort of thing. And there was often a kind of, and it suited some of the people involved. It wasn't necessarily an exploitative relationship, but it was a way of, if somebody had enough work, and some of them were, pretty, they were legitimate business people, like all through the 70s or 80s, whatever, doing this kind of stuff. But then this would have developed into a kind of a more sinister thing where you had kind of, pretty greedy, nasty types who were exploiting vulnerable people. They were recruiting people from, outside soup kitchens and homeless shelters and offering them £50 a day and a place to live. So you're talking about people who had nothing to lose and would go work for them and be, essentially...
totally exploited, not paid at all.
And not paid at all, would just basically get paid in some cases in scrap food. They'd get paid in alcohol. So, they were getting their addiction fed or whatever. And, they were long suspected of doing this, of this exploitation. I mean, there was one case involving, it was the Billy Connors was the kind of the patriarch of this particular family. And in 2008, a skeletal remains of a man were found in a shed on a site near where they were, which was near Cheltenham in the UK. So police knew kind of more or less what was going on, but couldn't do a whole lot about it.
Because there was no complaints made by these slave workers.
But there was also, the legislation wasn't there. And that changed in 2010. And they were able then to start bringing these cases. And they were very, very specific. And they went after it. So I think there was a particular...
Did that mean they could investigate without somebody making the complaint? That they suspected that this was happening? And
they put up surveillance. And certainly, again, there was Thomas Lyncham Connors, who's separate from the Billy Connors case. And they were both put under, major surveillance operations. There was cameras set up across from Billy Connors' site. And they watched him, they watched one victim being hit with a brush and being shouted at. This is all around 2011, I think, when they kind of carried out raids separately on both these operations. And we're able to kind of show that there was a long pattern of it, of abusing these guys. But amazingly, even though like some of them were rescued, they were annoyed that they wanted to go back. As far as they were concerned, that was their only home.
That was their job.
And that was their job. And they were quite happy there. And and there was some unusual kind of, I suppose, kind of potentially manipulation going on. One of them was specifically asked, are you suffering from Stockholm syndrome, which is the idea you identify with your captors. And of course, he denied it and was annoyed that police prevented him from going back to, the caravan he was living in. And he was saying, this is my only home. And there was certainly one of the, and it was an argument that they all used then themselves in court that, these people were free to leave anytime they wanted and they could have gone anywhere. And, we weren't holding them against their will. And there was a group of them, of these vulnerable people were kind of supporting them in their arguments, and not all of them would give evidence against them.
So you have vulnerable people who maybe have addiction, particularly to alcohol, but they're basically being paid in that, in alcohol. If they're taken away from that situation, their first fear is where they're going to get their alcohol.
Yeah, and you're talking about people really at,
and they probably have lost whatever skill set they had once to be able to get that alcohol themselves. So because they've been institutionalized almost.
Yeah, and that was the most recent. The reason why we're talking about this was the man who's described in court as victim A of the Rooneys, Like he was 26 years working for that family and, suffered brain damage and PTSD as a result of the treatment he got. He was hit with a block, had his teeth smashed. The same family, they had one guy dig a hole. How far should I dig it? And he says, keep going. It's going to be your grave. And, this sort of like cruel mental torture to kind of keep people, close, that they're going to be too frightened to run. And I mean, there was cases, certainly with Billy Connors, that, if somebody did leave, he knew where to find them. He knew their places they'd go. In the case of the Rooneys, there was a local vicar who had been a former army intelligence officer working in Bosnia. And he said they had to escort some people going to homeless shelters because they knew that the Rooneys, or members of the Rooney clan, would try and recruit them to work for them. So they would escort them to keep them safe. He compared the patriarch of that family. John and Patrick Rooney were the two twin brothers who got the longest sentence. They both got 15 years. And this, cleric, the former army guy, was saying, like, they were as bad as any warlords that he had come across in Bosnia at the time, that they were so manipulative and nasty about it. And the victim A was one of 18 men who were forced to work and live in terrible conditions under constant threat of violence, the way it was put. And 15 of those died before they ever got compensation.
Oh my goodness. And
this guy, victim A, was initially refused any compensation because he'd left it too late and he'd filled in the forms himself.
From the state, essentially, victims.
It's the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority.
We have similar here, don't we?
And so, and it's I think from what I remember, it's a really tight window. Like, and you have a very short time to get it in, and it's very specific, and it's not easy, like to get compensation for being a victim of crime in Ireland. Like from through the kind of the version of this process. But this guy then initially he was told he'd failed and he wasn't getting any compensation because he was too late or whatever way he filled it out wrong. And a charity put him on to a law firm, I think Freshfields, who were, top law firm in the UK, who represented Manchester City and all the, top sports clubs.
Now, his sister took the case for him, didn't she? Because he wouldn't have been capable of really representing himself or making decisions like that for himself.
Well, and through his sister, like he indicated that, he wanted to appeal this. And they came back with a smaller offer. And I think it was 1,600 sterling on the basis that... it was 2,000, but because he had an unspent conviction himself, that they were taking 400 off it. So they continued anyway and did another, they appealed against that, I think, to another authority. So SICA, where basically their decision was reviewed and he was awarded 320,000 sterling then. So which his sister said is going to be spent on the 24-hour care that he needs. But to think that he was... like 15 of those guys are dead.
Yeah. And that he was 26 years in slavery. It was 11 members of the Rooney family all went to prison for those crimes. But I think there was evidence heard during that essentially this was modern day slavery, human trafficking. They were identifying vulnerable victims and bringing them in to work for free while they were enjoying sort of lavish vacations across the world, and their slaves lived in squalor and filth. It's just an incredible idea that those people aren't entitled to anything. And obviously they went down, and this man, victim A, through his sister, went down the civil route to gain something back for all those years he lost. But it seems there was no point in them or him suing the Rooneys, because you probably wouldn't have essentially got anywhere with that, would you? You could be years tangled up in the courts, even if something was awarded. Given that these people did this to vulnerable people, they're hardly going to honour any award given and pay up, are they?
No, and I mean, I think with the Rooneys, they would have been ordered to pay back about, I think, $1 million or face more time. Not that we know of any of it ever reached any of the victims, and there was something like 2 million of other assets identified. But as you said, like, I mean, there was very colourful evidence of their lifestyle during that was heard during the trial. There was luxury holidays to Australia, to Egypt, to Mexico. There was high performance BMWs bought. There was spa days enjoyed by presumably the ladies in the family, and there was cosmetic surgery as well. Like, so they weren't holding back on enjoying their nice lifestyle. I mean, there's pictures as well of the kind of the shabby conditions the men were in, and then you can contrast them with the pictures of the lovely homes that the that the members of the Rooney family themselves were living in. So there was also, some of the gang were also involved in targeting elderly homeowners and getting them to sign over properties into their names and selling them on. And one of them, they did that they got 250,000 sterling for it. So, I mean, they're an out and out crime family in that sense, you know. But there was a real kind of sense of grievance, I think, on this family and others, some of the Connors that I was talking about now, the two separate families. And there's a real sense of this is unfair. We're just doing what, we've always done. And, why are we being picked on? And, and there was lots of self-pitying tears and sobbing when, first of all, they were found guilty by a jury. And then, sometime later, and they were brought back for sentencing, there was more histrionics and wailing and gnashing of teeth and people being carried out. And
their argument being what? That they paid these people in shelter and in food?
They just denied outright that there was any kind of exploitation going on. And I mean, like some of the judgments kind of was using language, like mean and cynical, and there was very hard headed, and they knew exactly what they were doing. And I mean, like it stands in complete contrast with the evidence that was given of the humiliation that some of these men were forced to endure, like including emptying buckets used by members of one family as toilets. When arriving, one guy recruited in Newcastle for, I think it was Billy Connors, on arrival at the site, had all his documents burnt and his head shaved. And this is, a pattern in one of the other cases as well. And, like 12 guys living in a tiny caravan, never any room, Sunday being the only day off. Like when the police raided, I think, Leighton Buzzard, which was the Billy Connors place, they did it on Sunday because it was the only time they knew they were going to be there. And that they were travelling all over the country doing this kind of work at the time, And even Thomas Lyncham Connors, like he would have been on the radar for a long time by the UK police. I think he was the first person who was subject of kind of an order, and not an exclusion order, but it was an order in the Enfield borough that he wasn't allowed to tout for business because he'd carried out so many botch jobs across North London. One of the local authorities was able to, like, they got a court order saying you're not allowed anymore to do any work in the borough of Enfield. And again, he was saying, look, this isn't true. I'm a horse dealer. Like, this is, I haven't done any of these crimes. And that was always the argument. It wasn't me. I didn't do it.
Have they continued with the investigations into these cases? Because there was a lot of kind of pomp and ceremony around, all that the police were doing, especially in the UK, sort of between about 2012 through to 17, 18, but haven't heard of a huge amount of them of late.
They are. We haven't heard, I suppose, because there's not necessarily Irish connections. There was just one, I think Operation Fort was a major one that they carried out, and it was the biggest of its type, and it was a Polish criminal gang that were recruiting similarly vulnerable men in Poland, bringing them to the UK and putting them through these kind of recruitment agencies that recruit manual labourers. And these guys then were being hired out to companies that say, sorted your recycling bin and all this kind of stuff. It was kind of tough old work. But basically, these guys were, they'd know English, they'd arrive in, they'd be told to sign this, sign that. And basically a bank account would be set up in their name without their knowledge, and the wages from the employment agency or from the company that they were working for would go directly to the criminal gang. And these people were never left alone. They were escorted to the shop. They were, again, same thing, fed scraps, all overtime, no days off, work every
They're like the male
moment.
version of the female sex slaves, literally, aren't they?
It is, yeah. I mean, you did the story, like you went to Romania. How long ago was that? And there was a connection with people being recruited to work on
farms in Ireland.
Farms in Ireland.
Yeah, that was years ago. That was maybe 2012, I think. Went out to Romania to track down those slave bosses that were caught here in Wexford, and they had people living in similar conditions, and they were picking fruit and stuff like this. And of course, the farms that had hired them here didn't realise they were slaves. There was a joint Romanian and Garda investigation, but we went out to kind of look at the premises or where the people that were running this were living. And of course, they were in these massive big, it's the usual story, isn't it? They were in these massive big mansions with as flash a car as you could have had in Romania back then. And, they were caught, jailed, and probably straight back at it. And a lot of vulnerable people to be exploited in that country at the time.
Yeah, and it's a ripe recruiting ground for these gangs, and no doubt it's still ongoing. I know in the UK they're changing the legislation that there is going to be an onus on companies to ensure that the people working for them, even if they're employed by an outside agency, are getting the money, and that there is a certain amount of welfare checks done. They can't just simply turn around and say, I didn't know that this guy was being exploited.
That just shows how widespread it is, doesn't it? If it's...
And that's probably the reason why Ireland are still only considered a tier 2 country by the US State Department when it comes to tackling trafficking, that we haven't brought enough cases, that we haven't enacted certain type of legislation, or that the legislation that we have brought in for trafficking, we don't use it. Like some of the traffickers who've been charged in Ireland have been charged with other offences, whether it's money laundering or running a brothel. They haven't actually been charged with human trafficking. There's a weakness there, or whatever, in our own legislation or our own approach. And it's, despite it, there's been some reasonably high profile cases. There was the legislation used, I think, in a case there in Mullingar. I remember covering it. There was 2 ladies convicted of running brothels, and basically they were recruiting women from Nigeria, using the juju religion curses to kind of terrorize these women into working as prostitutes. One of them, I think they managed to generate 55,000 in something like 5 months or 4 months from just her one woman. And there's one of these, there's a professor in the US, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce his name, but at the moment. But he was suggesting that a smuggled woman in the sex trade is worth 150,000 a year to, one of these gangs. So, guys sorting kind of rubbish or whatever, it's probably worth 35,000 or 30,000 a year. But if you've got 10 of them, that's 300 grand a year. And you have your gangers, who are kind of, keeping a group of people on board. So, if you're doing this at scale across an economy as big as the UK or France or Italy or Spain, you can imagine how much money is being generated by these kind of operations. And
we're seeing this in the Europol reports we discussed recently with Niall. Do you remember we looked over at the kind of the warnings that Europol were giving? Obviously cyber crime was something, corruption, and human trafficking was one of the kind of the growing areas of concern for Europe, because of course Europe is so rich.
Yeah, and there's people always going to be willing to take the chance of traveling to a foreign country on the promise that they're going to get a job. Certainly one of the guys in Operation Fort, a Polish guy, was just out of prison and had a big fine, owed money, and was promised he'd be getting 1,500 sterling a week. And he thought, well, damn it, I'll give it a go. Why not? And then found himself stuck in the, basically enslaved and couldn't get out, and was, working 12 hours a day. And with no ability to escape, and of course you're being manipulated the whole time, and it's your ability to kind of resist is going less and less. There's even, if you go back as far as, what was it, the case involving TJ Carroll, the Irish brothel keeper who was jailed in the UK. There's the statements of one of those women who was, clearly trafficked victim, and she was like 5 months or 4 months before she plucked up the courage just to get on a bus. There was no one with her. She was getting, phone calls or text messages to get on a bus. You're going to this address now in Drogheda, or you're going here to Athlone.
Without the language or anything. And she was just
very
little,
And luckily enough, one of the other women in the brothel was saying, look, just get on the bus and go here, and whatever it was, Garda station, and tell them who you are and what's happened. And she finally, at that stage, I guess it was at the point of she felt she was going to be, worked to death. Worked as in, being forced to have sex with, whatever amount, anything from 5 to 10 clients.
There's sometimes about 10 or 12 clients a day, those women, and they were getting paid nothing, and
and she was, she was hoodwinked, like the women in Mullingar, with a promise of, a better life in Europe. And in some cases, they were, they were coming over here, as far as they were concerned, to work in, a toy shop or to work as a nanny or something like that. They genuinely thought they were coming to a better life, and and that the people they were with, they trusted. And we've seen that pattern.
All that, so this compensation case, which has been, has gone through 300 and odd thousand for the victim, which will essentially be paid for by the state, presumably along with the legal fees, which is usually what happens if somebody wins a case or settles it. But that is a kind of maybe a kick up the ass to the state. This is in the UK, but this could easily happen here, to start investigating and to start cracking down and doing your due diligence around all this sort of stuff?
Yeah, well, there has to be. I mean, there's probably 60 or 70 people like Victim A just on the Irish-related cases that we know of. So, I mean, if you're talking about, a Polish criminal gang, you're probably talking in terms of thousands. And then there's going to be other criminal gangs. I mean, like the reason why the law was changed, surrounding modern slavery in the UK was the tragedy, and I think it was in 2005 in Morecambe Bay, where you had these Chinese people who were recruited to pick cockles from the sand from the sea. And the gangers brought them out, and despite warning from the locals that, the tide is coming in, or it's a particularly bad area at the moment, it's where the tide comes in faster than you can run.
Yeah.
And I think there was several, I can't remember the number, but there was like 12 or 15 people drowned and died. And they were basically, instead of going out to help them or calling, rescue services, they left them. They just left them to die and got out. And this is all for, whatever. Each guy collects a bag of cockles that they got, eventually will sell for €50 or something like that. So it was kind of small money. But, life was cheap. So they kind of forced them to relook at how they did things.
Listen, when it comes to the criminal underworld and what's going on and these gangs, like, human beings are just another commodity that's traded or that is worth, that can make money for you. So that's how it's seen. But, Victim A, it is a significant development. And obviously he was somebody who had, whatever his background is, we don't really know about the background because he's been kept anonymous. And obviously the sister is there, clearly much more functioning than our brother. You get the impression that he was somebody who just fell off the radar for all those years and yet still had, a family there who are now, helping him as he's come out of that. But you get a sense of the vulnerability there, don't you, from that brief sort of outline of that case we have.
There was one case where, a vulnerable man who was being cared for by his family had wandered off and they thought he was dead. And it turns out then years later he'd been exploited by one of these gangs. God. So, it's just, it's kind of, it goes against all kind of idea of any kind of decency.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something we thought we'd left in the past, but obviously not. Okay, well, thanks, Eamon.
Always a pleasure, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.